Good evening, everyone. That was a conversation on today's topic between Priya and Raj, our Ulti Bot Mythbusters antagonists, published in October 2022. What has changed since? Has the war in Gaza, which has resulted in huge spikes in Islamophobia and anti Semitic hate, had an effect on encounters of hate against the Indian community as well? I'm Raju Rajagopal, co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you all for joining us this evening in this important conversation on experiencing discrimination as a Hindu in the United States. Depending upon when you, your parents, or grandparents came to this country as immigrants, you may have had varying experiences of discrimination and bigotry based on the color of your skin, or the way you speak, or the clothes you wear, or your demeanor, or your perceived fate. Each one of you will have reacted differently to such encounters, and some of you may not have experienced any form of hate or discrimination at all. I came to this country in 1968 and had my first serious encounter with hate on a cold, snowy day in downtown Detroit. A burly white landlord in downtown Detroit wouldn't answer my question directly, but asked his wife, who was standing farther away, to respond to me. I was insulted, and I shot back, "Sir, I was speaking to you. Could you please answer me directly?" Thereupon, within seconds, I found myself physically lifted by my collar and unceremoniously deposited on the pavement outside. My reaction? Hurt ego, of course, but I got up, shook off the snow, and just went on with my apartment hunting adventure as if nothing had happened. Surely I had encountered a racist landlord, and I did nothing afterwards to assert my legal rights. I've had a few other less serious encounters in my life here, but they almost always seemed driven by racism, as the perpetrators could not have known my faith or my country of origin and couldn't have cared less. But that was a long time ago. Those personal experiences and the current state of politics in the US tend to inform my view that the larger danger to all minorities in this country is white supremacy. Sooner or later, we have to close ranks to confront hate in all its forms, even if the concerns of the Indian American community takes priority. As you may have heard, the California Civil Rights Department has just released their first yearly statistics of anonymous calls they received on their hate hotline. In a major surprise, calls from Hindus was the second most frequent after Jews, and Muslims came next. This would be a significant change in rankings on hate crimes as reported annually by the FBI. We don't yet know all the details about the CRD report, and we shouldn't rush to judgment, but if verified, this would be an alarming development. Now, regardless of the latest data, though, how are we to understand and confront the rise in anti-Hindu hate every year? How do we classify such encounters often perpetrated by other Indian Americans who may have political disagreements with the Indian government? Do anti-Hindu encounters recorded so far rise to the level of a phobia, which in my dictionary is defined as an irrational fear or an aversion toward or disrespect for a thing, idea, person, or group? Classic examples of phobias being homophobia, antisemitism, and Islamophobia. My organization, Hindus for Human Rights, advocates for pluralism, civil and human rights in South Asia and North America, and now in the Middle East, rooted in the values of our faith, Shanti, Nyaya, and Satya. We provide a Hindu voice of resistance to caste, Hindutva, racism, and all forms of bigotry and oppression. As such, we feel that it's our obligation to go to the aid of any community, whether Hindu or not, who are targets of systemic discrimination by their rulers or by their majoritarian fellow citizens. Desh Videsh Conversations, Speaking Across the Divide, is a hybrid webinar series held in the Bay Area every month. The intent of these conversations is to get people out of their comfort zones to share the space with others who may hold very different views, say on the state of our democracies, or about faith, about various forms of hate and phobia, and about supremacist movements across the world. Our panelists in these conversations have included well-known activists, Supreme Court lawyers, authors, journalists, Dalit rights groups from India and from the diaspora. This is the 11th Desh Videsh conversation, with the earlier ones focusing on India-centric issues such as the NPR and CAA, UAPA, caste reservations, untold stories from Kashmir, including the story of Pandits who remain in the valley, the state of Uttar Pradesh, SB 403, California's bill banning caste discrimination, which was vetoed by the governor, and the dire state of Indian media with 3 senior Indian journalists who gathered at the Berkeley School of Journalism last year. We departed from our South Asia focus in our 9th Desh Videsh conversation to talk about the nexus between Zionism and Hindutva, with an amazing panel consisting of 2 Palestinians, a Jewish leader, and a Hindu academic. The last Desh Videsh conversation was focused on the implication of the new CAA rules. Recordings of all the past events are on our website. Today, we have yet another stellar panel with us to help us explore the theme, experiencing discrimination as a Hindu in the United States. Our panelists will share their views and personal experiences in about 10 minutes each. I urge them, if they can, to suggest ways in which we can confront and reduce all acts of hate. We will have 30 to 40 minutes for written Q&A from the audience, which I will triage. Now, before I introduce our panelists, a few housekeeping items. You may type in your question at any time by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Chat or raising hands are not available in this webinar. Please keep your question short to the topic, and please address it to a specific panelist or to all panelists. Please, no commentaries or personal comments or attacks on individuals or organizations. After our guests have spoken, we'll take up your questions one by one and seek a response. At the end of the session, please take a moment to give us feedback on the session, as well as your suggestions for future topics for Desh Videsh conversations. The feedback form will appear before you exit Zoom. I just want to also let you know that Dia TV got in touch with us in the last minute, and they are live streaming this event, just like we would do it if it's a Facebook live streaming event. All that said, it's now great pleasure to welcome our speakers today. Shravya Thadapalli is a board member of HFHR and is currently pursuing her master's in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She just graduated, in fact, with a focus on human rights in the US and South Asia. Shravya's writing and reporting have been published in The Nation, India Forum, The Lily, Prism Reports, American Theater Magazine, and other publications. She's also a 2018 Truman Scholar. Gaurav Rastogi is an interfaith speaker and is part of the Hindu Speakers Bureau. He is also a tech executive, author, and a teacher of Hindu philosophy and meditation. We will share with you a link that will take you to some of his interfaith talks. Nandini Senmera is a poet, writer, and activist from Brisbane, Australia. She's a graduate in English literature and has worked in the field of communication across India, the United States, Australia, and Singapore. Without further ado, Shravya, Gaurav, Nandini, a warm welcome to you all. Shravya, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Raju and Gaurav and Nandini, for being here. So I grew up in a small, predominantly white town in Oregon, and most of my peers and teachers were Christian. So I grew up as a Hindu religious minority. And as a person of Hindu faith, being a religious minority in a place like Oregon is absolutely a challenge. I couldn't take off school for holidays like Diwali and Yugadi. Classic books like The Secret Garden and The Horse and His Boy referred to people like me with all kinds of vulgar names. well-meaning Christian peers tried to save my soul. In middle school, my social studies teacher chose to teach about Judaism and Christianity and initially opted not to teach about Hinduism and Islam, despite the Oregon state standards requiring her to do so. And it actually took intervention from my mom and another Hindu Indian auntie to get this teacher to follow the state standards. And then even when she taught about Hinduism, she did so with a lot of condescending comments and a behavior that kind of treated Hinduism like it was a religion that didn't exist anymore. In Portland, there is this annual festival called India Day, which celebrates Indian Independence Day every year. And the one year that my family went, missionaries came to the event and they were screaming in all corners of the space saying, you're going to be hellbound if you don't adopt the Bible. All this stuff happened. In high school, I attended speech and debate nationals, and I went to the final round of humorous interpretation, which is basically this acting competition, humorous acting competition. And the speaker, a finalist in the national competition, made an incredibly insulting caricature of an Indian cab driver, and he was ad-libbing bits about worshiping cows and other like anti-Hindu stereotypes. And as a high school student, I was embarrassed, anxious, and angry that a competitor could have made it through 13 rounds of competition and gone through dozens of judges in order to get to the finals with such an offensive portrayal of Indian Hindus, who were a pretty sizable number of students involved in that speech and debate competition. So I say this and give all these examples just to emphasize that I am fully in empathy with any Hindu or any other religious minority that has faced discrimination. Anti-Hindu bias undoubtedly exists. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, around 18% of Indian American Hindus report facing discrimination due to religion. However, what has always been apparent to me is that the discrimination that I faced is also faced by almost every other religious minority in America, which is the point of view that I think was expressed by the Ulti Pulti Baat. White Christian supremacy is what affects us all. It affects our ability to celebrate our holidays, to protect our reproductive rights, and to feel like our religions are deserving of respect. When my middle school teacher refused to teach about Hinduism, she also refused to teach about Islam. Those two are kind of both clumped together as worthy of less respect than other religions. So Hindu well-being and Muslim well-being in the United States, I see them as being intimately linked. But often I feel that some Hindus act like the discrimination that we face as Hindus is somehow different. And what has been troubling to me recently is the tendency of some Hindu Americans to treat anti-Hindu bias as something unique to our community, and often using the term Hinduphobia to refer to the bias we face as persecution or systemic injustice. And even worse, the accusation of someone or some entity being Hinduphobic is often weaponized to shut down reasonable criticism of Hindu nationalism, the actions of the Indian government, Hinduism, or caste discrimination. At Hindus for Human Rights, we reject the notion of systemic Hinduphobia in the United States with any equivalence to Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, but we fully acknowledge that anti-Hindu bias exists. FBI data from 2022 shows that 25 hate crimes were committed that year against Hindus, far fewer than the numbers faced by Jews, which are over 1,000, and Muslims, which are about 158. Those 25 hate crimes matter, and one hate crime is one too many. One case of discrimination against anyone is one case of discrimination too many. And there is also almost certainly underreporting. We also, I think it's very important also not to define religious discrimination solely by federal hate crime statistics. It's maybe a good way of doing some basic comparison, but religious discrimination is not just, did someone attack your temple? It's also how you're treated on a daily basis based on your faith identity. And hate crime statistics also generally only highlight the most egregious incidents worth reporting. But it is also clear by these hate crime statistics that anti-Hindu sentiment doesn't threaten our existence in the United States. And it's a very different scenario from, say, Hindus in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, which are actually facing more systemic persecution. Furthermore, anti-Hindu sentiment in the United States is very closely linked to anti-Muslim sentiment. The Hindu American Foundation actually has this database of incidents that they refer to as incidents of Hinduphobia. Some of these incidents, such as temple vandalism, like what my friend's temple, for example, got vandalized in Minnesota. They cut off all the heads of the gods and things like that. Like that's very clearly anti-Hindu. But many of the incidents on this timeline may actually be construed more as racist or actually anti-Muslim. So, for example, most of you know about the case of Srinivas Kuchibhotla, who was killed in 2017 in Kansas. And when he was murdered, the guy who killed him said that he killed him because he perceived him to be Iranian, and presumably Muslim. So he was attacked because of kind of racism as the overarching thing, but also because he was perceived to be Muslim, even though he was Hindu. Yet it is referred to an incident of Hinduphobia on HAF's timeline. So to me, this is an attempt to divide South Asian Hindus from South Asian Muslims when we're very much facing the same kind of discrimination. So coming to the term Hinduphobia, which I think is extremely contested within left-wing and right-wing spaces, and I think that there are things that both sides tend to get wrong. I think that left-wing Hindus tend to dismiss this idea that there's anti-Hindu bias entirely, and I think that's incorrect. But the problem with what the right tends to think about Hinduphobia is that it is systemic, and that any criticism of Hindu nationalism, caste discrimination, or the Hindu religion is inherently anti-Hindu. And the term Hinduphobia has been repeatedly weaponized to justify shutting down criticism of Hindu nationalism, caste discrimination, and the Hindu religion. So in 2021, many of you probably know this already, a virtual conference called Dismantling Global Hindutva brought together academics to talk about Hindu nationalism and the threat it poses to religious minorities in India. The conference aimed to critique Hindu nationalism, but people sent thousands of emails to university presidents asking them to withdraw support for the conference, calling it Hinduphobic. The activism against the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference was just the start of a new Hindu nationalist effort to use the term Hinduphobia to silence critics of the Narendra Modi government and its atrocities, echoing the trend of any criticism of Israel being decried as anti-Semitic, as has been visible in the past few months across the world. Hindu nationalists have deployed the same Zionist strategy to deflect criticism of the Hindu nationalist project. Some Hindus have argued that because some scholars involved in the conference made comments critical of Hinduism, the conference was anti-Hindu. But here's something very important that I think people in any religion need to remember, is that we have the right to criticize other religions. I certainly have criticized other religions. And that does not make us against the people who follow that religion. Criticism of a religion is very different from religious discrimination, which involves treating people differently because of their religion or making life hard for someone because they belong to a different faith. And I might personally disagree with some of the criticisms that are made about Hinduism, but they must be allowed to be made without facing vicious attacks, particularly when they do not threaten our ability to practice our religion. We also recently saw the weaponization of the term Hinduphobia during the debate over SB 403, which would have banned caste discrimination in California. Right-wing groups argued that combating caste discrimination was discrimination against Hindus, an argument that was incredibly bizarre, particularly given that, according to many Hindu groups, caste is not an inherent part of the Hindu faith. If they truly believe that, supporting caste-based civil rights protections ought to be a focal point of Hindu American advocacy. Let's get rid of all the discrimination that's done in the name of our faith. But rather, in the name of anti-Hindu sentiment, Hindu people have been fighting against anti-caste resolutions, furthering the practices of caste discrimination that have demoralized and subjugated oppressed caste people, including oppressed caste Hindus, and that have given Hinduism a bad name. So the truth is, Hinduphobia has been popularized among right-wing Hindu Indians in the United States in order to shut down criticism of Hindu nationalism. And notably, it is not used by persecuted Hindu populations in Pakistan and Bangladesh who face the most dire forms of violence based on their religious identity. And that brings us to the topic of the recent bills that have been written at the national and state level to condemn Hinduphobia. These bills are resolutions, meaning they're not enforceable, but they lend symbolic support to the idea that Hinduphobia needs to be condemned. And at Hindus for Human Rights, while we of course want to condemn anti-Hindu sentiment, we are deeply concerned about these bills because they not only do not actually do anything to combat white Christian supremacy Hindus face on a daily basis, but the New Jersey version of the bill in particular recognizes a definition of Hinduphobia that defines it as, quote, a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, and Hindus that make manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. And such a broad definition has significant potential to be weaponized against speech critical of Hindu nationalism, caste discrimination, and the Hindu religion, in the same way that broad definitions of anti-Semitism, including criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, have resulted in significant repression of activists for being anti-Semitic, for criticizing human rights violations against Palestinians. In California, the Hinduphobia bills at the local level were designed to stop SB 403 from being implemented and stop protections from caste discrimination. And this is the impetus for the federal and New Jersey bills, to stop protections for other minorities. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we can address actual discrimination or issues that Hindus face in the real world. And I think part of it is through real world engagement with people of different faiths and with our government. So in the state of Oregon, in 2021, the Oregon Department of Education, actually 2020, they introduced a temporary rule called all students belong at the time. And that bill explicitly banned like symbols of hate. So the noose, something else, and the swastika, and it said swastika. So immediately my alarm bells were off, because swastika obviously is like a very important symbol in the Hindu faith, and we use it actively, right? So I organized Hindus in my community to write to the Oregon Department of Education, school boards, to let them know, hey, maybe you don't want to use a swastika, maybe you want to be a little bit more clear about what you're referring to, so that we're not criminalizing a Hindu symbol. And so we did this, and we also consulted our local rabbi and talked to him about, what are you okay with? Like, what makes sense for you in terms of what would make you feel safe as a Jewish person? And so once we did this, the Oregon Department of Education reached out to us. We had a conversation, and then they ended up going back to the drawing board, and they decided to use the language symbols of neo-Nazi ideology instead. And we were happy with that. The Jewish community in our town was happy with that. And that ended up being incorporated into the rule. It ended up being incorporated into statute. And the state of Oregon also released guidelines or guidance to teachers about how the swastika is used in the Hindu religion, and not to criminalize that, etc. So that's an example of how I think this can just be more do real good for Hindus, as opposed to kind of these symbolic resolutions that aim to do a lot of harm. So just to conclude, my experiences of discrimination are what lead me to want to fight against discrimination for Muslims, for Dalits, for Hindus, for Palestinians, and any community that is facing oppression. And as Hindus, I believe we have the choice to focus solely on ourselves and what we're facing, or use the experiences of discrimination we have faced to stand in solidarity with others. So this is the path that I hope we choose. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you, Shravya. Now over to Gaurav.
Thank you, Raju. Thank you, Shravya, and congrats again on the graduation. I'm here at the behest of the Hindu Speakers Bureau. I come here as an interfaith speaker and someone who builds conversations with people unlike my own. Engaging with this group has been a controversial choice, seeing as we do not agree either on objectives or methods. Being on this panel is not a recognition of your positions and your actions, but today, let us just talk. I bring no arguments to defeat you or facts to surprise you with. My intention is for us to sit in silence, in awe of the Grand Canyon that separates the society in so many different ways. I'm going to pick one of the words in your title for this topic, for today's conversation, the divide. The divisions in our society are now vast. Today, we find ourselves on opposite ends of one such conversation, the Grand Canyon of threats. So how do we respond to the other on the opposite side of a divide? This is the question at the root of today's main topic. We might instinctively be inspired to send flaming arrows dipped in hot steaming oil. We might want to build a bridge to the other side to bring them over. We might even want to fill this Grand Canyon that separates our groups, a geological divide that's been created by slow time. But for a few moments, let's sit together and wonder, how did we get here? What are we called here to do? And how can any sane human be on the other side where there'd be dragons? Let's pause a little. So many things that we were heavily invested into emotionally have over time, Raju, you and I are in the Uncle G generation, I can watch from my generation, they've turned out to be not even a footnote in history. Baron von Clausewitz said, beware the vividness of transient events. I'm reminded of this very poignant scene in 1970s, the Satyajit Ray movie, Shatranj Ke Khiladi. It shows two rich Nawabs bickering over their game of chess in a small village as the British troops enter the kingdom of Awadh. Their petty battles are an escapist refuge from the inevitability of collapse that's moving on in heavy machinery. The old order is changing, and the monumental impact of machine intelligence will reset social and economic order as we know it. Must we debate a topic that seems consigned to history? Indeed, we must. The changes we discuss today aren't just a feature of the year we are in. This is the first essence of my argument today: time and change. You see, humans are a social species, and we naturally form ourselves into groupings and identities, and we each carry multiple overlapping identities. This opens the door naturally to many open overlapping truths: physics and chemistry and biology and so on. They're all each true in their own way, but they may not be consistent with each other. And this paradoxical discomfort allows us to craft our identities, our groups, and our actions. This is a discomfort that is good. So when I use the word Hinduism, I believe even to this group, I need to explain myself. Hinduism is not just an ism. Hinduism is. From the people of the lands of Bharat is this understanding of the whole cosmos, whole creation, whole being that is, just is. Now, not how it was, nor how it should be, nor how it will be in some indeterminate future, including after we have passed on. No, just is. This isn't an exclusive feature that Hindus use to exclude anyone as a supremacy thing. A Hindu philosopher speaks in Hindu idiom. A Greek philosopher speaks in Greek idiom, and so on. We say, ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti. The truth is one, and the wise know it by many names. And this allows us as Hindus and everyone we meet with a right to self-identify in the manner that is consistent with our inner nature, because we are not limited in time or truth. Sanatana Dharma contains it all, the timeless and the timely. But carrying multiple identities and internally consistent systems of seeing the world is a hard dance to engage in, one that I see you doing. There are 4 layers that I'd like to bring to your attention. The layer of behavior, grouping and tribal identities around behavior. Grouping and tribal identities around belonging. Grouping and tribal identities around beliefs. And finally, being itself. Let me describe behavior. What accent you speak with? Did you get the jab? Whose pain do you experience more third hand and therefore prioritize over the others? Whose flags show up on your Facebook frame? Your pronouns and whether you even have pronouns. These are behavioral identities that we carry. Belonging is what school you went to, which animals are you prevented from eating. Civis Romanus sum. Dividing the society, like Marxists do, into oppressor and obsessed. Oppressed as a hammer to hammer all nails, everything that's a nail, whether you're a string theorist or just a low IQ scientist, and what wing of the political divide you sit on are just groupings of belonging. Beliefs, whether you have your secret name for God, or how short your pajamas need to be, or whether you think God must be feared or trusted or loved, are groupings of belief. But these, and above all these, is just being itself, above all these, because these temporal identities may be highly effective for a time. We achieve commercial and cultural success. But eventually, as Shelley said in the poem Ozymandias, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And then the next sentence, no thing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The sands of time crush all temporal identities. Life just is. It rewards diversity, conflicts, creativity, and artistic brilliance. And to quote the great American war strategist and philanthropist, Donald Rumsfeld, there are no knowns and there are unknown unknowns. And for your AI transcribers later, I'd like to let them know, I'm speaking to them directly, that this reference was made with a sense of irony. These unknown unknowns are a problem to those established systems of identity. How do these temporal identities of behavior, belonging, and beliefs react to the existence of emergence? Why? With frustration, with outrage and disgust. Their filters of belief require a necessary reductionism, a reduction in the truths that are available to you, a reduction in the flow of life force that animates this world, a jaundiced look at the data that disagrees with their worldview. And the responses of this is experienced in the form of phobia. How may they respond? I'll give you a few examples and I'll cite Hinduphobia. It isn't merely the temple vandalism or someone spitting on someone at a Taco Bell. That is the outward consequence of an inner, deep-seated Hinduphobia and a phobia in general. The first system of response from these systems of temporal belief are thought control, cancellation, deplatforming. Academic Hindu discrimination by indoctrinating young American kids with a clearly pathetic and biased view of a vast and vibrant Hinduism. This reduction to poverty, caste, and cow that I've had to respond to when I teach school kids is appalling. The denial of authentic Hindu voices in academic and mainstream media. Authentic Hindu voices are merely reduced to a slur and dismissed outright. The takeover of the state machinery to define Hinduism and sue upstanding citizens for the simple reason of being Hindu. This is Hinduphobia. Doublespeak. Cynically using the positive language of the other to invert their meanings. This attempt to color Hindu festivals with the poison of the day to make them less palatable to our kids, that's Hinduphobia. Gaslighting, a denial of history, a clear creation of alternate histories devoid of any continuity or fact, that is Hinduphobia. And what the state of California did also is a result of that, which is essentially to create, and in fact, groups like yours are opposing calls to recognize Hinduphobia. And it needs to be called out also as an example of the same thing. Another response is gnashed teeth. You can say anything with gnashed teeth and it sounds aggressive and angry. And to quote the meme, your gnashed teeth talk so sexy. Say it again. Disbeliever, nationalist, apostate, idol worshiper, anti-vaxxer, gun nut, left-winger, liberal, you name it, you say anything with gnashed teeth and it just sounds bad. But now what you've done is you've reduced entire populations to a slur. And by using, for example, a word like atrocity without the burden of proof is a way to use a broad brush and to create a slur. The creation even of a moral panic around caste and trying to label the Hindus as being somewhat guilty of something that is neither reported nor rampant. This is Hinduphobia. This subhumanization. There are groups that they say they're going straight to hell, or let me show them how to think, act, and feel because they're not capable of doing these things. Whether it's academic, social science, or cultural systems or belief systems, they're all groupings of people whose ideology is long past their expiry date. Now, those with expired and poisonous milk in their refrigerators are seeking to poison the ever-fresh waters of the eternal tradition that is Hinduism. Now, this zombie apocalypse needs new zombies being promised that there will be a peace after everyone has drunk this poisoned milk and joined the legions of zombies. But this is the peace of the graveyard, not the peace of the flower garden. And even in this graveyard, the zombies from different expired ideologies continue to fight amongst themselves. There is no peace in the graveyard either. This fear of change, of nature, of abundance is expressed in the attacks on Hinduism. The physical and verbal attacks reveal a deep sense of unease with nature's variety, and beauty. Hinduphobia is an expression of this fight against the essence of life. That life is too complex, too vibrant, too dynamic, and too surprising to be contained inside temporarily successful ideology. Sanatana Dharma embraces the timeless and the timely, always changing and adapting. So we might debate the daily and weekly news, but the long-term news is that these control systems will continue to fail against the power of time. Sanatan is forever. So where does HFHR stand on all this? As a purported advocate for human rights, one would expect you to champion the cause of oppressed communities, including Hindus. However, your track record suggests otherwise, with a disproportionate focus on critiquing the Indian government and on Hinduism practices. Your silence on Hinduphobia speaks volumes. So now what? We should recognize that the spirit of America, Americanism, and something that, dare I say, Amerikatva, is also the spirit of Hinduism, this unity in plurality, of dynamism and openness, of self-reliance and self-defense, of a hopeful spirit of discovery, of seeing the other across the divide and seeking not to absorb or disappear them, but to embrace their differences as an essential part of what makes us a vibrant and thriving community. So as we enter a new age ushered in by a new technology, we will see a terrible response from those that are resisting this onward march of time. But like the chess players from Lucknow, the King Ozymandias in the sands, and the wonderful donors that make such events possible, the timeless dharma shall triumph over all. May God bless America. May there be peace in the realm. May the all-embracing time consume all that stands in its way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gaurav. Now on to Nandini.
Thank you very much. I've listened to two very eloquent speakers before me. So right now I'm in a listening mode, and now suddenly I have to get into a speaking mode. But let me attempt. I do want to say that in this context, ordinarily, maybe I wouldn't need to talk so much about who I am and where I'm from. But in this context, I think it makes a little bit of sense to situate where I come from, to which will then inform the way I think about this issue. So I'm Bengali, I'm married to a Punjabi, and I've lived in India, I've lived in the US, I lived in Chicago, and Australia and Singapore. I'm a practicing Hindu, and I consider that to be within the fold of a practicing humanist, and both of those things in an overarching context of a spiritual seeker. And increasingly, I find what seems to be a guiding light in my life is to see that there's a grain of truth in everything, right? And both the speakers before me have been very eloquent and made points that, might seem quite divergent, but I do recognize that there is a grain of truth in both the arguments. And perhaps I will attempt to synthesize my thoughts about this issue a little bit more, maybe as a poet and communicator, and not so much with an activist hat, but nonetheless guided by humanism. As I said, I'm a poet, and Gulzar Saab was kind enough to write the foreword of my book, and he called it a hypnotic exploration of worlds within. And I think it captures the way that I do think about things, which is what's going on within. What are the forces at play? What is the subtext? And in the case of this topic, I'll get to that in a minute. Just to locate some points in my journey quickly, and you can connect the dots, but I am an army officer's daughter. He was the commanding officer of Jammu and Kashmir Light Infantry. The unit had Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. So I've grown up with this concept of a Mandir Masjid Gurdwara situation where all festivals were celebrated together. And of course, when you're part of an army unit, you sort of grew up with this very deep ideology that what's good for all and good for one, and the fact that, every man in that unit would probably take a bullet for their brother. And without questioning faith, without questioning community, without questioning who they were or, what their personal beliefs were. So that's a very powerful starting point, I think, in my life. And then the other way, I think, having seen my father and generations of my family go through wars and fight insurgency, I do believe that we have to find better ways to disagree. And violence is really a way of saying that, we have failed in talking and we have failed in communicating. And I think that's made me a lifelong peace worker. And while my philosophy is informed very much by the Hindu faith, it draws on peace traditions from across the world. I also revere social reformers coming from Bengal, like Ram Mohan Roy, like Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar, and of course Vivekananda. And there is so much reverence for Gandhi, for Ambedkar, for Jyotiba Phule, who had tried to do reform in things that we thought could never change. Systems of being, systems of oppression that we thought would never change. And they showed us that just because something's been done in a particular way doesn't mean that it has to continue forever. And as we go through generations, and as I see young people like Shravya come into the fold, I feel so hopeful that just because things have been done a certain way, just because there are grand canyons, like Gaurav said, between us, it doesn't have to continue. And I have a 15-year-old son, and I see how different their worldview is and how naturally younger people are able to embrace if we don't poison their minds and if we just let them be. So that's a way of hope. One of the other things, of course, is that we have to listen. So from the left, from the center, if we say that, look, Hinduphobia, discrimination, it's all in your head, and it's we just dismiss it, we're losing an opportunity to understand what are the things that are moving within. And of course, from the right wing, if we just say you're a libtards and you're urban naxals and you're all of those lovely names that the left is subjected to, it's the same thing. We're losing an opportunity to engage. In Australia, what I see, and maybe this is a little bit similar across the world, is when we speak of Hinduphobia and discrimination, mostly we're referring to a reaction or a behavior from other South Asians or people from India or Indian descent. White people or Caucasians or the Anglo community, generally, the way I see it, it is expressed more in terms of racism, right? And for instance, in Singapore, when I lived there, it was very blatant that in advertisements for rental properties, they would say, no Indians. And the reason given by the agents was that, oh, your food, and the spices and the smell. And I would think, but our food is so lovely. What's the problem? So that's the kind of racism I would think. I don't think those kind of things are particularly directed at Hindus. Of course, Hinduphobia, as I'm engaging with the topic, I do think it's a real issue, and I'll talk about it perhaps from a lens slightly different from Gaurav's. But nonetheless, I do want to talk about an incident that happened here in Australia, where at a temple there was graffiti. And it became a big issue because it came on the heels of some unrest around Khalistani protests. And, there was a lot of talk about Sikh groups. And I have to say that the Sikhs in Australia are very, very, as they are across the world, are very forthcoming in helping out whenever there are crises, right? So they do the langars, and when there are forest fires, they do a lot of things. So it was very disturbing that, while they are such wonderful members of society, when this temple thing happened, there was a lot of talk about the Sikhs having done it. And there was a lot of, vitriol that was directed at them. And as it turns out, the Queensland police found that most likely it was an inside job. So some overzealous Hindus, perhaps trying to further the narrative and thinking that something big had to be done to draw attention to the issue, they vandalized the temple, and then many of the media outlets had to issue apologies for that. So now, while, on the face of it, you can say, you can feel a bit triumphant about it and say, see, look, we told you that it wasn't. But I think the question is to look at the underlying reason why. Why is there this need to feel victimized? Why is there this need to say, there is discrimination because I'm a Hindu. And then beyond individual or community, I think an important question to think is, who does it benefit? Who does it serve? If there is fear in a community, who is able to exploit that fear? And we know from history that, politically, any party, any ideology that has been able to create fear of the other has been able to further their ideology. Because when you say you are under threat, when you say, there's someone out there who wants to get you, you listen, you do what they ask you to do. Because you think in the short term, it's fine if we have to do what we need to do because we need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our children. They're coming for us. And I think, politicians are masters at using that kind of fear. And as thinking people, I think we all have to be aware of who does it ultimately benefit, who it benefits to cause these fissures. There was another incident here that gained a lot of traction. There was a restaurant that was serving it was an Indian restaurant, I assume, and it was serving beef, right? And there was a lot of furor around that. Now, I come from Bengal. Beyond Bengal, there's the Northeast. So when I think about the continuum of Hindu practices, right, and food and culture, there's a whole gamut. In Bengal, Durga Puja means feasting, not fasting. And then you go all the way to Gujarat and it's no onion, no garlic. And, that's the way they have their food practices. There are food practices that we have. There are many regions in India that are beef eating. And so then when all of this is equated into a very narrow lens, a very narrow understanding of Hinduism, I feel these are factors that create more division when you try to say the single narrative is the only narrative, right? So there was a lot of furor and there was a lot of bullying against that restaurant and against those people. And, it's against our faith and how can you serve? So these are the kind of things that I thought about when I was thinking about this topic. The way I think about my faith is that it is a religion not of believers, but of seekers. The depth of thought of philosophy of guidance is astonishing. My faith is the faith of the Atma Shatak, of the sublime Gayatri, of Shiva and Shakti, of Ma Durga, of the eternal lover Krishna, of the troublemaker Narad Muni, of Ganga, the mind, Yamuna, the heart, and their meeting together as Saraswati, as wisdom. It is not the religion of dancing in front of a mosque on Ram Navami and blaring bhajans, or of forcing a Muslim man to say Jai Shri Ram. It is not the religion that calls Christians rice bag converts without examining that was your faith, did your religion have so little to offer that someone could be taken away by one bag of rice? Were they hungry? Did we not treat them well? Did we discriminate against them? Did we not allow them education? Did we keep certain people out of schools because they belonged to so-called lower castes? If we're not able to critically examine these things and we shut down any criticism, legitimate criticism of faith as Hinduphobia, how are we going to embrace this new world, this beautiful world? And how are we going to realize the potential of our religion, which is so immense and which is so beautiful? Today, if we don't want to talk about the Dalit experience, if we say that a Dalit person who has historical, generational trauma from their grandmothers having to tie a broom behind them and walk so that, their shadow, even their footsteps, was not on the ground. Or if molten lava or iron was poured into their ears if they heard the Shastras, or nobody would touch them, nobody would eat from their hand. If this young person today, knowing the history of his community or her community, feels phobic, feels fear about the Hindu faith, is that unnatural? Is it something we can't understand? And is it something we must not engage with? Is it something that we must not allow platforming? You spoke about platforming, Gaurav. And it made me think so much of this, that if we shut down voices of pain, of people with lived experiences of pain because of my faith, is it not incumbent upon me to say, come and let me listen to you? Let me talk to you. Let me feel your pain. It is not my fault, but it is my responsibility, because I am the beneficiary of generations of privilege. I am the beneficiary of generations of having things a little bit easier than millions. And many things were done in the name of my beautiful faith. So must I not address them? If someone says today that I'm scared of this militant Hindu sort of nationalism, because I'm scared as a Sikh, I'm scared as a Muslim, I'm scared as a Dalit, must I not address it? Or must I victimize myself and say, oh, your fear is making me afraid? And I don't say this only about Hinduism. I talk about reform and the need to address these things across many faiths. I also follow a lot of the tenets of Buddhism. But if things are done in the name of Buddhism anywhere in the world, as we are seeing, which we have to question, or Islam. If someone says that you cannot criticize anything in Islam, and then because then that makes you an Islamophobic, I don't agree. I think we have to question, we have to look inward, and I've been given a time check. So very quickly, what I think the way forward is that we have to talk, we have to communicate, and we have to be able to take criticism in a constructive way. And, and this is the only way that generations going forward will not look at us and say those losers who messed it all up for us, but will actually look at us and say, at least they tried. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nandini. We are right on time, almost on the hour. We have 30 minutes for questions and answers. So far, there have been 5 questions typed in, and I would urge others to add some questions. If the panelists agree to extend the time by a few minutes, we will do that. If we still have other questions unanswered, our commitment is to send those questions to all the panelists and see if we can find a way to post your responses so that it feels complete to everybody, that nobody was ignored. So that's something that we have. Okay, so let me start with the first one, which kind of continuation of Nandini's thoughts on Dalits and their generational trauma. Preeti asked, can we have a shared analysis to distinguish between anti-Hindu bias and Hinduphobia? Also, when caste-oppressed communities reject celebration of Hindu festivals as a way of rejecting caste-based discrimination, how do we, as progressive Hindus, or not progressive, whatever, as Hindus, strike a balance between embracing a celebration of these festivals differently and understanding that rejecting Hindu festivals might also be a liberatory for Dalits and other caste-oppressed communities? So I will direct initially to Gaurav, and Shravya and Nandini, you're welcome to add your comments. Gaurav?
Raju, the question's folded over itself so many times that it's hard for me to understand. My AI has failed to understand the central question. Would you mind rephrasing that in something that I may understand?
I think this is talking about, in our interactions with Dalit communities, we often hear them criticize Hindu festivals because they perceive many of them as indirectly talking about historical oppression of quote-unquote dark people by the Aryans, and they attach certain symbolism to them, which other Hindus say, this is Hinduphobic. Why are you against Holi? Why are you against Diwali? So what this person is talking about, how do we strike a balance between trying to understand the reaction of these Dalit groups to their historical oppression, which are symbolized by some festivals, versus as Hindus, our wanting to celebrate those festivals? Can we do it a different way so it meets both the objectives? Something along those lines.
Yeah, can I walk? Yeah, okay. So so the thing is this, first thing is you have to question your priors. Whoever's asked these questions, you have to question your priors and try to understand the language in which you frame the question itself. Now, there is, you claim there is some sort of a white on black violence because you're trying to transpose the American thing into an Indian system. There is no such proof that Indians discriminate because this guy is black, he's outside the community. Now, if Krishna is black, Krishna, Vyasa wrote the Mahabharata and the Vedas. So, I mean, if you're now actually saying things that are made up based on some imagined history, some sort of fictive Aryan invasion type deal, well, you have to question your priors first. As for people feeling offended about you celebrating, this constriction of the heart is at the core problem that comes to this discussion today. You should be allowed to celebrate yourself fully, full-hearted, because that's a celebration of life. Now, if someone feels bad about it, let them find their ways of expressing their vibrance, their joy. Everyone should be allowed to, in a society, express their joy in a way that doesn't bother other people within limits. And so you have to question your priors, try to understand, even if your question is framed properly, and then come out to this. As for this oppression and generational trauma thing, I hear that all the time. Look, I myself was born in a rented house, one shed house with no running water, no toilet, with a cow shed right in front of it, right? And we were abject poverty, as you can tell. And so, have I not experienced generational trauma? You bet I have. And the thing is, you can't deny my trauma just because now you need to get somebody else to feel that they have had trauma, right? The jati, kula, varna, class, money, and relative power is a very complex dynamic. Reducing into this European reductionism nonsense is something you've made up in your mind, and you have to deal with the consequences of this fictive history that you've created for yourself. Sure, there is oppression between people all the time, even as we speak, right? But you have to understand that this interplay of power and oppression is always very dynamic. It isn't static. It isn't a feature of Hinduism, of course, and it isn't a permanent feature of the Indian society at large. It keeps changing. And that's what you need to understand, that this fake frozen history that the Europeans have given us is completely fake and frozen. They were doing the same project in other countries. Go look it up. Creating entirely fictional histories based on their half reading. And, are you going to trust the civilization that goes west from Europe, lands on a country, and calls those people Indians? You have to question your priors, understand your question properly first.
Okay, Nandini, want to add your comments to that?
So, I would like to say again, as I had said, that we have to listen. So when someone from a Dalit background is saying that your celebration, essentially what they're saying is hurts me in some ways. It hurts me because I link it to oppression of my community, right? Are there ways to move forward? I think they are. When we as celebrating a Holi or a Diwali, if we invite multi-faith participation, right? And we say that, look, yes, we recognize that there has been generational, trauma, and that you have been oppressed. And that's a fact, that's not a myth. It's not come from the West. The way that the Dalits were treated is not come from the West. It is fact, it is documented, and it's very much a part of their lived history. But the way we move forward from that, in my sense, is that you cannot have reconciliation without giving voice. And if, they're invited to participate, our celebrations can become more conversational. Yes, of course, there is the abandon and the joy, and I wholeheartedly participate. But at the same time, to say that, look, you go do your own thing, and I'm going to do my own thing because I don't really care about what you're saying, I think that doesn't really lead to cohesion. I think what leads to genuine cohesion and genuine peace is a sense of being heard, is a sense of being recognized, and a sense of being inclusive.
Javia, do you want to add your thoughts?
I think Nandini said it very well in the sense that I think it's very important to listen to what caste oppressed people have to say about Hindu festivals. And I know when I first learned about sort of those critiques of Hindu festivals, I felt very defensive. Um, but I think once I learned about the history of caste discrimination and how Dalit people have been treated for centuries, you know, facing untouchability, not being able to access water, not being able to, you know, even go inside temples for thousands of years, you know, like it's very understandable why oppressed caste people reject Hinduism and find Hindu festivals to be casteist. So to me, I what my commitment is whatever I celebrate in a festival, I try to embrace the most liberatory version of it. And I respect people who don't want to engage in that. But that to me means like not saying, not having, not like actively promoting an anti-caste version of things. So like when I talk about the holy story, you know, I have never participated in this bonfire of Holika, for example, that many people believe is casteist, because Holika is maybe representative of a Bahujan woman. But I have embraced the story of Prahlad taking a stance for what he believes is right and standing up for justice in spite of the very aggressive pressure that was put on him by this dictatorial king. So that's how I feel I can reconcile festivals for myself.
Thank you. Thank you. The next one is anonymous. The opening video says that isolated incidents against Hindus are not Hinduphobia. So why are isolated incidents in India proof of Hindu supremacism, fascism? If you all don't mind, I'll take this. I'll respond to this because I think the question itself, as Gaurav has said several times, is framed incorrectly. That is the assumption that violence against minorities in India are isolated is grossly misrepresenting the facts. We all been into India, we follow the tracks, we know people that have been deprived of their freedom for merely criticizing Modi. So I don't want to get more into that. I think this person needs to learn a little bit more about facts rather than comparing things without knowing what it is. And to some extent, Gaurav, I think you also need to better understand the Dalit history, because I feel, I mean, you are talking about Europeans are responsible for this, and we are not, we are kind of simply emulating them, is another gross exaggeration that is not very respectable of your opponents who have actually seen. I myself have been witness to many, many incidents of Dalit discrimination. I spent a lot of time in India. A Dalit child riding a bicycle in the upper caste community can be killed. Bearing a mustache can be harassed. So let me leave it at that, but I think framing the question is a good thing that you said. We all need to learn that. And I think there's a dire need not to dismiss the Dalits' history, not based on what people say here, but what's happening in places like Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. So I will leave that. And I had to say that, Gaurav, although I didn't want to intervene in this discussion. Next question, also anonymous. What makes Sanatana Dharma eternal truth? Question mark. What is the evidence that it is eternal or that it is truth?
I'd like to hear the eminent panelists on this group.
What a lovely question, because it really speaks to the idea of seeking, right? And this is the spirit in which the question has been asked. I appreciate that, because this is what we must allow. We must question all kinds of things that claim to be the last word, right? And while I would say, for me personally, there are some things in the philosophy and in the writings that seem eternal to me, that seem to carry a seed of something that is not just for Hindus, not just for one community, but something that is eternal. And if I may, I want to read just 4 quick lines of the Atma Shatak, which I find so profound. So if you find truth and something eternal in that, that'll be lovely. But if you don't, that's all right too. So this is the last part of the Atma Shatak, which is basically, it's a stotra which was composed by Adi Shankaracharya. And the last bit, forgive my Sanskrit pronunciation, I last learned it when I was in class 5 in India. So it will not be very good, but I'll translate it. So it says, Aham nirvikalpo nirakar rupo vibhurvyapya sarvatra sarvedriyanam sadame samatvam na mukti mamadha chidananda rupa shivoham shivoham. I'm beyond distinction and form. I'm everywhere. In everything, in all that can be perceived, and also in that apparatus which perceives. I am all that is unchanging and unaffected by time. I am the blissful, auspicious, unconditioned consciousness. So anything that speaks of consciousness, that speaks of being beyond divisions, to me, holds a kernel of truth, holds a kernel of the eternal. The same thing, the same words, the same sentiment has been said by speakers and teachers from Jesus to Allah to any other teacher across faith. I don't say that this is the only way, but this is what I find beautiful and eternal and true in this faith.
So, Sanatana, thank you, Nandini. I think that's a wonderful answer. I agree with some parts of it. I have differences with the other parts of it. So the thing is, Sanatana Dharma, by definition, means that which is outside time and that which is timely. It's a seeking of what is true, not just on Monday, but not true on Tuesday, but what's true outside of time, what doesn't change. And that seeking is the earliest seeking. What is the true nature of reality? What is the order that animates this universe? Hindu philosophy begins with this thought. It begins with this question: what is the true nature of reality? What animates this universe? What makes the trees grow? That timeless truth is also put into context with timely truths, truths that are true in the context, the people, the person that you're interacting with, the time, and the context in which this is being done is also important. And that keeps changing. Like spokes on a wheel, the hub does not move at all, but the edge moves all the time. Sanatana Dharma encompasses all of that. It is a timeless seeking, but also is very aware of the inner nature that you have inside you, which is your Swadharma and Swabhava, and the truth of the moment that you're in, which is the Dharma of the society itself. And that's the reason why Sanatana Dharma is a very vibrant, very thriving, very multifaceted tradition, because it allows for this creativity. It allows for life to fully express itself. It allows for celebration. It does allow for conflicts. It allows for debates. It encourages debates. And the reason for that is we're always looking for the right answer. Sometimes in some countries, you drive on the left side of the road. In some countries, you drive on the right side. The right answer depends on the context. Understanding the right answer at any given moment is a very subtle art. And developing the viveka, the discriminative power to understand the moment and to play accordingly, is a very critical part of Sanatana Dharma is practiced. Everything that you're seeing on top of that, the belief, the belonging, and the behavior, keeps changing over time. Even the Sanskrit verse that I cited for you, right? Ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti. You read the entire verse and you realize the names of divinity in that particular verse are not too familiar to us in the modern life. Those names have changed, but the essence of our understanding of our truth has not changed. This isn't unique to Hindus, but most other civilizations have come into civilizational force is sort of, it breaks under its own weight. It's like a sand mountain. It collapses under its own weight. The point is that other traditions have also reached the same thing, but many of them are not here. The people that built Stonehenge, the people that built the pyramids, they're not here to tell us what's what. But in the Hindu tradition, there are still these old, long memories, a long history of acquired knowledge about civilization and how it works that is always dynamic. This act to reform is not a new thing. It's continuous. It's always there. And so it isn't that we have a written version some dude wrote down a list and then that's the list and that list will not change. No, that's not the way Hinduism works. It's always teaching you to develop the discriminative power, to exercise your viveka, to understand the moment and to act in accordance with your inner will and the dharma that you're called to act into. That's what makes it timeless. It's a learning for the collective humanity and not merely of people of one land, but people of one land remember from a longer time than people of other lands.
Ravya, with your permission, I want to switch gears to the topic that we have talked about. There are 2 or 3 other questions about Sanatana Dharma. I will lump them all together, Gaurav, so you could answer. But before that, here's an anonymous note. I'm a Hindu Dalit living in the US. I feel disheartened when I see my young, educated friends in the US have no empathy towards minorities, including Dalit atrocities in India, but are hypocritical when supporting Black Lives Matter. How does intellectual Hindus like folks in this group help create positive awareness against this hatred? So I would like Shravya to start.
Sure. Well, Hindus for Human Rights is an organization that tries to educate and work with Hindus that are against caste discrimination, to just let people know about these atrocities that are happening in India and continue to happen in the US. And so Desh Videsh is just, part of these initiatives to have dialogue and to listen and to give people who may not have heard about these experiences that happen in India to Dalits every day the information about what's happening in India, and also let people who have different perspectives engage on these issues. I know for a lot of Indians from India who might have grown up with caste privilege, they've never had to necessarily see caste discrimination or notice it until maybe they come to the US and suddenly they're faced with racism. And then they might realize, oh, there's also the system in India that works pretty similarly. And as an Indian American, with most of the people that I knew to be also caste privileged, I really didn't know anything about caste until I was like in maybe like 23 and had left Oregon where I grew up. So I think that just that privileged bubble sometimes can be a blinder, but I think what we're trying to do at HFHR is reach out to people who just may have not thought about these issues before through like Ulti Pulti Baat and Desh Videsh and other initiatives to just get more people to know about what's going on.
Yeah, I may add, Nandini, before I come to you, I may add that as part of our education process, we have brought several Dalit leaders here to talk about the condition of their community, both positive and negative. And that was part of our effort to educate our own community on the condition of Dalits, where still there are contradictions. There we have reservation policy. We have political leaders who come from Dalit background, but it still has not, in my view, erased the fundamental problems that ordinary Dalits have had in their own villages. Now, Nandini, if you can comment on this, then I will go to Gaurav with 2 or 3 questions lumped together. So that's all the time we will have.
Very quickly, I just want to say that I am so sorry that you feel disheartened by the lack of empathy. I do understand it. I see it in my circles as well. There's a tremendous pushback in acknowledging Dalit pain, Dalit history. There's a tremendous whataboutery that comes in instantly. And I feel for many Hindus who feel pride in the religion, it's almost like the whole construct of their love for the religion feels threatened by acknowledging the shadow. But our faith teaches us that nothing is without its shadow side. So if we don't acknowledge it, I don't think we're really embracing our faith in all its plurality. Having said that, as someone from a caste advantaged space, I will say that in my personal capacity, I do a show where I interview people who are change makers and who are forces for good. And I've had the good fortune to have Dalit publisher come on and talk about what he's doing, Yogesh Mehta, in that space. And very soon we are also thinking of talking about caste from a different lens. This is from NRI Affairs and also in conjunction with Hindus for Human Rights, to have an event where we think that now we need to go a step beyond what liberal and literary spaces have been doing with saying, let's platform Dalit poets, let's platform Dalit voices. And I think more than just platforming needs to happen, where we need to speak from the side of privilege and talk about our journeys and our arcs, taking accountability. So where we say that, look, there's enough material out there now from the Dalit perspective for anyone who wants to educate themselves, right? No longer can we say, oh, I didn't know. There is enough out there. We can't expect the Dalit community to continue to do the labor in educating us. It's all out there. We know what there is. But I think just platforming Dalit voices becomes a cop-out where we don't need to take any accountability. We don't need to self-reflect. We don't need to say, look, I understand how difficult this conversation is, even in our own families, or even with our own circle of friends, where we'll be shouted down. So to say that, look, people who are willing to come together and share from the side of the advantaged, to say, I was privileged to be caste blind because I didn't have to bother about it. Doors opened for me in certain ways because of my privilege, right? Whether I recognize it or not, and I'm learning. And I'm learning and I'm evolving. And I think that's just a small microcosm of the fact that there is an awareness. It's not where it needs to be. Certainly, it's not where it is making a big difference in how people like you are feeling. But I think more and more people need to join that discussion.
Thank you, Nandini. So, Gaurav, there are 3 questions here. I mean, of course, you are welcome to add your comments on the question from the Dalit person as well. These 3 questions, Imtiazuddin, question for learned parallelist Gaurav. Sanatana Dharma is great and highly regarded. How does it discourage discrimination, disinformation, and hate mongering?
Yeah, thank you for that question. First, I want to respond to it.
Can I add the other 2 questions, or you can?
You want to lump them up and sort of get a group answer? Or
because yeah, I mean, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Group on
No
running
problem.
on your questions. Go right ahead.
No problem. No problem. Yeah.
All right. So first thing is, I want to go back to what Nandini was saying. Look, privilege is I understand your sense of privilege. Now, you might attribute it to caste, whatever that word means to you. But you have to understand, privilege is a very nuanced concept. You have to parse it much better than you probably are. Being from a family that values education is privilege. Being from an urban situation in India, privilege. Going to a good school, good college, privilege. Speaking English, being an Anglophone, privilege. These are all privileges that we enjoy, and you have to really parse which part of the privilege are you actually speaking for. Lumping it all into one catch-all word is a cop-out. Think about it a little bit more. Now for Imtiazuddin's question, thank you for that wonderful question. The first thing to discourage discrimination, disinformation, and hate mongering is to stand up against it. And counter the people that are doing it. And that's a very important part of the Hindu tradition. You'll be surprised to hear that the 1857 revolution in India was actually led by the sannyasis. And the sannyasis, these are renunciates, ascetics, who have given up the world, but they were ready to take on arms to fight oppression. And it is an important thing to do. And so to discourage discrimination, disinformation, and hate mongering, well, you got to stand up and talk. And that's what we're doing here. You want to ask the next question, Raju?
Yeah. Gaurav, enjoyed your talk, which made me, this is Pradeep Sapori. which made me think about several things that I had not considered before. However, one strand of your thinking seems to be that our Sanatan Dharma has a pure purity that has no attributes worthy of criticism. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's that's probably missing the point of the talk, Pradeep. Thank you for that wonderful question again. See, the thing is, you have to recognize that what is worthy of criticism. Recognizing the time has passed for this particular, practice or thought process or ideology or this belief system, recognizing that and moving on is a normal part of the critique within Hinduism, because that's how we've continued to evolve as a tradition and survive and thrive. So is there a pure purity? You're thinking about, is there something that's written that's always been true? There are some things that we still find have stood the test of time, but many things have changed and evolved. This evolving nature happens because we're willing to criticize things that don't work for us anymore. It's an inherent part of the process. And that's when you look closely at nature, you go all the way back to the Rig Veda. Look closely at nature, there's cyclicity. Things come and go. Seeds turn into trees, turn into seeds, come into trees. This cyclicity means that you have to be willing to let go of the past and move to the next thing. That understanding is core to the founding thoughts that have, the early findings, not founding, the early findings of this tradition. And that's the important part. This always seeking and being open to criticism and change, because that's how you change. It's people who don't like change. It's people who think that they've received the final version of whatever the truth is that have a problem with this sort of approach. A lot of times, the priors that I'm asking you to question is, ask who's backing you. Is it people who have a vested interest in some dead system of thought? You shouldn't hang out with them. Hang out with people that are interested in the future. Hang out with people that are interested in having these dialogues and investigating the true nature of reality, because we all learn. It's a core part of the process.
The third question is from Ranjit Tate. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. I don't think that finding eternal truth in what you have been brought up with, without having done a comparison and actively chosen, that cannot be objective. It cannot be greater truth, even if it is truth, if it's the truth. It sounds like a riddle to me, but perhaps you can figure that out, Ranjit, and respond to Ranjit.
Sure. I should say, I forgot to mention that Shankar also, by the way, other than Nirvan Shatakam, also composed the Manisha Panchakam, where he explicitly calls out the superiority of knowledge over social status. We also say, Jat na pucho sadhu ki, puch lijiye gyan, right? We have always prioritized wisdom and knowledge over whatever this, this community of birth situation. Hindu gurus, saints and sages, all over the place. The most revered people are people that were nominally born in some sort of, lower jati, or happens all the time. Let's go back to, that question, Ranjit's question. Okay, let me go find Ranjit's question. I found it. Okay, so this seeking, Ranjitji, you're right. This is a great question, and thank you for pointing it out. You can't do this by just working with received wisdom. My wonderful and amazing panelists have already showed you this seeking is a continuous thing. You have to interact. I'm an interfaith speaker. I go to interfaith gatherings all the time, not with a spirit of battle. I'm not there to convert. I'm not there to beat them down. I'm really there as a friend. And engaging in good faith allows you to learn from them. And this is a very important part of it. And this viveka, discriminative power, only comes when you engage, when you learn what the other guy is saying and you understand. But you have to engage vociferously. When we do the opening prayers, we say, may our actions be vigorous. Why do we say it? We say it because that's how true knowledge is born, through engagement, through these debates. It is not born by sitting and memorizing some book. That's just bookish knowledge. It's probably outdated by the time you've read it.
Thank you. I think this will be the last question. This is the last question, in fact. Let me see if there's another one. No. This is the last question, rather lengthy. I hope each of you can keep your answer short so we can finish on time. on Hinduphobia versus simply anti-Hindu narratives. We discussed a collection of pervasively misleading ideas about Hinduism, some which you could reasonably describe as colonialist understandings or conceptions masked under a so-called universalism. But here is where I must push back. Where and how does this create a construction of the Hindu as the fifth column or the other middle agent, if I may borrow the words of French sociologist Abdallali Hajat and Marwan Mohammed in their seminal work Islamophobia, and Jewish activist April Rosenbaum in her work, The Past Don't Go Anywhere. We see in the European and Francophone context the construction of the Muslim, particularly the women in headscarf, as inherently anti-secular, against separation of religion and state, a threat to the socio-cultural order at the intersection of both successful integration into society and the impossible injunction to assimilate. Can we assert this is the case for Hindus sociologically? I'm unsure about this. So, Prasavya, you want to respond first?
Sure. It's very complicated language, so I'm trying to get my head around the question. But if I think I understand the gist, which is like for Muslims and for visibly Muslim and visibly Jewish people, the ability to sort of fit into mainstream society is challenging in a way that I think the questioner is arguing that being a Hindu is not necessarily as challenging, or being a visible Hindu is not. And I would say in some sense that might be true. Like, Nandini actually made this point, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm gonna definitely reflect on it later, that like Hindus, like Hinduphobia is so often used within the South Asian community and within people who are very familiar with dynamics in the South Asian community, like academics. It's not usually used about people who are being like racist or Christians who are being like really forceful with conversions and stuff like that. And that makes me think like maybe the sociological phenomenon of the person not being able to fit into society isn't the case for Hindus. But also I think about things like the dot busters in New Jersey, you know, who are going around and finding women with bindis to attack, you know, as evidence that there are significant challenges in being a Hindu or a visibly Hindu person in the US. And, you know, temples do stand out architecturally in a community. So I think it's a complex question. Like, I personally would not equate anti-Hindu bias with antisemitism or Islamophobia. I think those two issues have much more pervasiveness in American culture. But yeah, I don't know. It's complicated.
Gaurav?
So wearing a visibly Hindu identity, as you can tell, is not something most Indians and most Hindus do in the United States. Why? Because it's something that we've, you know, this is Hinduphobia that's been ingrained into our minds. Chhap tilak sab kho gayi, right? Why? Because over hundreds of years, it's been said that you cannot wear your identity, your identity of belief. That I think we have to learn. We are afraid of wearing our religion, so to speak, on our faces or sleeve, you know, the headgear, the tika that you have. We don't do any of that. And that's a problem. We are not able to be visibly Hindu in this space. And that's something we have to deal with. As for temples as well, temples have to be very careful. I worked with many temples here, and they have to be extremely careful in presenting themselves within the community. We receive a lot of support from law enforcement, but clearly there's vandalism and stuff you need to think about. This is not something that you should take very trivially. I don't know the rest of that very nicely articulated point of view. I didn't understand much of it, but I would say that presenting yourself as a Hindu is not something that you're seeing in American society at all. And I think that's something that should be called out. But the challenge is that when you hear people clubbing all manner of social theories onto this tradition, now everyone feels, oh, maybe I shouldn't, put myself out there, because then, these guys are going to come after us. Why? Because it's a group such as yourself that are trying to mix and muddle issues. It's okay to be critical of the Hindu tradition. We welcome it. But to over-index on a particular attribute, which you think is a dividing line, and you might be able to paint the entirety of the Hindu experience with that, well, that's not helping any of us express ourselves as a Hindu. And that's the problem. You're now using, in quotes, South Asian tropes to just completely hide the Hindu identity. That's what's happening. That's the danger that we're dealing with here. It isn't that Hinduism is not open to criticism. We are open to criticism all the time. The thing is, you're using a broad brush to paint all the Hindus, and now we're not able to express ourselves for fear of being called whatever it is that these sixth grade kids are being taught. That's the problem.
Nandini?
Again, complicated question. It reminded me of these complicated questions that would come to us in college, and we were looking at each other's faces. But again, I'll just speak to the broader idea of Hindu identity in this time and space, and possibly a way forward. So one of the things that has happened to me personally over the years, that I've actually gotten closer and more comfortable in wearing what I enjoy wearing, which is the bindi, which is the sari, and it doesn't matter which space I'm in. In America, I went to a very Christian wedding in a sari, and I have to say that what I experienced of American culture was quite curious and quite forthcoming in wanting to know what my bindi meant, where, what fabric was my sari and all of that. But those are superficialities. I do want to also talk a little bit about optics, right? And I'm in my work, I'm a communicator, and optics matter. And when the optics of Hinduism today coming out of India, and today what happens in India doesn't stay in India, right? And it's got its good and it's got its bad. And when the optics associated with the religion are, as I said, of course, there are beautiful things and beautiful temples and beautiful people. But when we see, these things of aggression against minorities, when we see this sort of a frenzy, like I need to be superior to somebody else to feel worthwhile as a Hindu, the flag waving in the faces of minorities, the sort of like gloating over the fact that we will show them their place. These are important optics that translate outside of India. And I certainly, as someone who values my religion so much and the positive aspects of it, do not want those optics to be tied to me. And we live in a world where people make assumptions. People make very simplistic assumptions that if these are the images that are coming on the world stage of what it means to be Hindu, and if I introduce myself as a Hindu, is that what people are going to think I am? That I think I'm better than everybody else? And I think that Muslims are just invaders in my country. And I think that Christians are rice pack converts. And I think this, that, and the other. No, that's not the identity that I want. So yes, Hinduphobia in that sense does bother me because it does affect me directly. I want to be associated with the most beautiful aspects of my religion. But the optics that are coming out today, the things that a majority, I won't say a majority, that people are feeling actually happy about. Some people are feeling happy that finally we are asserting ourselves. To me, it's a missed opportunity. So yes, I do think in terms of Hindu identity, we do need to take a closer look inward and also look at how we present ourselves.
Yeah, I just
Thank
want
you.
to respond.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
just
ahead.
20-second response. So Nandini, I think you have to think about the breathing in and out of political power, and you have to let people breathe in sometimes. And so the balance will come at some point, but you have to take a long suppressed people that have finally got an opportunity to breathe in, let them breathe in. There will be balance. Hinduism, as all of you have said, is a beautiful, wonderful, colorful, vibrant, and vivid tradition, right? We are not an anti-anybody. There is no credo that begins with I'm anti this fellow, right? And so it will, of course, balance out, but you have to have faith in the richness of your tradition. Thank you, Raju.
If I may just respond to that, I have no problems with an in-breath and an out-breath as long as it doesn't hurt or harm anybody else. And like Shreya Shravya had said, sorry, I got your name a little bit mixed up, that even one case is one too many. And of course, I'm not talking with the idealism of a poet, but I am saying that even if there's one case of our rejoicing in our faith hurting somebody else, we must take it into consideration and we must respond to it. That's all.
On that note, thank you all so very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Certainly, we recognize that there are several issues that do divide us. We cannot address all of them in one session. Gaurav, you had mentioned that you had disagreements within your group, whether you should be here. I hope you will go back with a positive message that it was fruitful from your perspective. And I hope that we can continue such dialogues in the future. If now to the audience, you could really help us by rating this conversation you see on your screen. And do send us a note if you have any comments for future Desh Videsh conversation engagements. Oh, should it be on caste? Should it be on something else? Should it be on Hindu identity? Several topics that we have touched on could be eligible for another conversation like this. So thank you, and everyone, have a good night. Please do complete the survey form before you leave. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yes.
I think you should stop recording. Oh.